So this presentation is going to be about adjusting valve clearances with a specific type of valve mechanism, which is known as shim under or shim over bucket. Okay, so I'm going to start with this GIF, just to have a look at this to remind you of what a camshaft does. All right, so you can see here it's an animation of pistons going up and down and an overhead camshaft arrangement and where the cams are pushing the valves up and down. Now this unit here that I'm currently waving my cursor over is known as the cam follower, or commonly by mechanics is referred to as a bucket, because it's a bit like an upside down bucket. It covers the top of the valve stem. Right, so the valve stem goes up inside the bucket. If you imagine this is a bucket upside down. So technically it's called a cam follower because it follows whatever the camshaft does, or the cam does, but as I say, commonly known as a bucket. Okay, so that's kind of relevant because we're going to be talking about shim under bucket or shim over bucket arrangement. Okay, so this diagram here just shows you, I'll just point out a few bits. You can see the camshaft, it's a diagram of the camshaft. So that's going to rotate. This here, as I'm hovering over it now, is the bucket or the cam follower. And you can see, as I say, it's like an upside down bucket that sits over the top of the valve spring. And when the camshaft rotates, it's going to push the valve open or closed, or actually the camshaft will push the valve open. And then obviously, as we've mentioned before, the spring pushes the valve closed. And to ensure that the spring does close the valve, we must have a bit of a gap or a clearance between the cam and the bucket or the cam follower. Okay, just some more images. I'm going to shift this across and bring in another diagram, just because I felt this one, because it was a line drawing, this one's just a little bit clearer. So you can see again the camshaft pushing this whole unit down to open the valve, and then the spring here, which in this diagram has been cut in half, will close it again. Okay, and this image here is one I found on the internet, but it's you can see here it's a Ford. It's actually a Zetec engine, so it's very similar to the ones that we have on the stands in the workshop, and you guys have all removed camshaft. So I took this screenshot from the internet because the exhaust camshaft has been removed, and you can just see, once this camshaft is removed, you can see the top of the cam followers or the bucket sat just underneath each one of these. So obviously this is a 4 valve per cylinder, so it's got 2 exhaust valves for cylinder 1, 2 for 2, etc, etc. So they're the cam followers or the buckets. And to remove those, once we've got the camshaft out, we can use here. There's whoever's taken this one out has used a magnet, on a stick, and they just pull out. Or alternatively, you can grab hold of them carefully. As long as you do it carefully, you can use pin nose pliers just to pull those out. All right, so that's what they would look like. Okay, once they're out, that's an image that again I found on the internet. This is the shim. It's a bit like a washer or a spacer. Think of it. It looks a bit like a coin, I suppose, but it's a set thickness. All right, we can get thicker or thinner ones to make the gap that we have between this and the camshaft bigger or smaller. So if we want a bigger gap, we fit a thinner shim. And as you can see in this one, that sits in the top, a little recess in the top of the bucket. On some engines, there's a diagram, just of the previous image. Let me just go back. So there's an image of an actual bucket with the shim sitting on top of the bucket, and there's a diagram of it. You can see here they refer to it here as a shim over bucket. Now alternatively, we can have the shim under the bucket. Right, now in this image, they've annotated the shim here, but actually I'm going to just bring in my own arrow, because actually that's the shim there. So the shim now is underneath the bucket, but sat on top of the valve stem. And just so that you can imagine, or don't need to imagine, I'm going to show you what they actually look like. So there's the cam follower or the bucket, There's a little sort of recess in the top of it, and these are the actual shims. Got some more images here. There you go. All right, so now we're looking at the top of the valve itself. Here's the valve spring. There's the top edge of the valve stem, and this here is the shim that would sit on top of that, underneath that bucket. Okay, so in our workshop, this vehicle here, the Fiat Punto, has shim over bucket valve clearances, or the valve arrangement is a shim over bucket. So first off, we need to, if we're checking the valve clearances, we need to know what they should be. So I've got auto data here. Let's just run this video. First thing I'm going to do is type in my registration number. So it's Y289VJW, and then we'll click the search, and that brings up the vehicle details. Just check that we've got the right vehicle, Fiat Punto. Okay, now we've got a whole list of specifications here. We go to the technical specifications, and that brings up this menu here, and we want the service checks and adjustments, because valve clearances are something that you do as a routine maintenance. And okay, so we've got all the vehicle, the engine specifications there for the valve clearances. You can see that the inlet, let me just actually bring that so we can see that separately. Sorry, there we go. So the valve inlet clearances should be 0.25 up to 0.35 millimeters. And it's worthy of note that the engine should be cold when you check them, because obviously when you start the engine and run it up, it warms up and all those metal components will expand, and so the clearance between components will reduce. So we should be checking the engine when it's cold, and as you can see there, inlet clearance should be 0.25 to 0.35 millimeters, and the exhaust valve clearance should be 0.35 to 0.45 millimeters. So what we're doing here is using a feeler gauge to check the clearance between the bottom of the cam and the cam follower, and we just slide progressively thicker feeler gauges until we find the one that's a really nice snug fit, and then we'll make a note of the thickness of that feeler gauge. So in this case it was 0.39 millimeters. So I've made a note of that. Now I'm going to use, there's a special tool that you can see here to remove the shim. So you sort of use a tool to push the bucket down, and then there's another tool that I'll slide in here to wedge it down. Okay, once it's held down, now I can get my magnet in, and I'll just tease it out with a screwdriver and then use my magnet to retrieve or pull out the shim. There we go. Okay, so here's the shim, and you can see that this one is 2.60 millimeters thick. Now some shims don't have it written on them, they're not engraved, so we would have to use our micrometer to measure the thickness. So as you can see, this one was 2.6. So let's go back and check our specification. So the maximum clearance that our inlet valve should have is 0.35 millimeters. And we found that we actually had 0.39 millimeters. So we need to do a calculation to find the difference between those two. So 0.39 minus 0.35 is, as you can see here, 0.04 millimeters. So we need to do another calculation. Let's consider our existing shim, which was 2.60 millimeters, and we need one that is 0.04 millimeters thicker to take up that clearance. So we add those together, and we need a shim that has a minimum thickness of 2.64 millimeters. So now I'm going to look through my stores and find an appropriate sized shim and go ahead and fit it. Here we are, sliding the shim back under. And once I've got it in and located, I can use my tool just to push it down in and make sure it's nice and snug in that recess. And then finally just use our feeler gauge to check that we've now got the correct clearance. Job done.